Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to CuriousJohn number 58. Did I win? Did I guess correctly? I am attempting to do this podcast for the second time. Originally, I did this podcast on the road a few weeks ago when I went to go visit an old friend. Shout out to Splinter Cell. And I was trying to get it out in time for my normal Monday drop. But the problem is that a lot of the time, the quality just wasn't great. Here's a small snippet. Coming back from a little road trip, hauling A on the highway, a little too probably fast for what this is. But I digress. Nothing like driving fast in the middle of the night with a whole bunch of cars, headlights, driving quick, passing people, all the good stuff, down a mountain road. You know how I do. Anyways, I digress. And while that's a cool atmospheric kind of thing, as I was talking about, I was on the road when I tried doing this, and it just wasn't great. I didn't like the quality of it. I didn't like the flow, if you will. I didn't like my thought process, specifically because I was driving on the road, and I was, no hyperbole, it was at nighttime, dark, lights on, semi-heavy traffic with spaces of very fast driving. So I was definitely focusing on what I needed to focus on, which was driving and being safe, but also trying to get my mind wrapped around the concept of this week's topic. And so, in order to keep a higher level of quality, I decided to re-record this podcast, primarily because it just wasn't as succinct as I normally would like. That takes me focusing on the topic a lot more than just the driving. So, I digress. That's probably more than some of you folks like to know about the process of editing and producing this podcast. But back to the topic. So this week's podcast is going to be almost a continuation of a few recent podcasts. Recently, we talked about the idea of removing your past experiences and that removing pieces of who you are and who you are now. And that could be good and bad. It could be accomplishing things that you've done and or bad choices you've made. You can't take the good or the bad. You never know what those things were, right? That was about 1 or 2 podcasts ago. This is very similar to that butterfly effect of if you change something in the past, how much will it change in the future? If you guys haven't seen that movie, I'm getting a little too old. Anyways, I digress. So essentially, what we're trying to do is talk about the idea that you can't do that. And this podcast, in a way, is an extension of that same idea. So I'm going to go back a little bit, and I'm going to even go further back to previous podcasts where I've kind of talked about very vaguely about certain things kind of going on, right? So today will be one of those days where I open up and show you a little bit more behind the scenes. And before I get into it, I do want to say the reason why I don't often tell you folks things as they're happening is because sometimes I need time to think about things as they're happening, give me time to plan things out. And there's a small percentage of, I guess, what some people would call superstition, where I don't want to mention things until they're far more situated or they're more concrete in a way. And the superstition comes from the idea of not wanting to ruin things before they're done. So a lot of my little things I've got going on are long-term projects. So it's probably worth talking about now. So in many podcasts in the past, I've alluded to the idea that I'm incredibly busy. I'm taking on more than I've ever taken on before. And there's just very little time in my life right now for anything else. And there's just a lot of things going on, primarily because of this extracurricular. So that's what we'll be talking about today. For those that don't know me on a personal basis, you probably do or don't know, but I've started going back to school. And that's a big one because that's something I've probably been deferring for far too long. And it's something I started in the beginning of the year. It was a commitment I made to get certain things situated. And I started doing that. And with that, it's a lot of online classes, a lot of studying, a lot of test taking, stuff like that. All things that I really, really disdain. And one later on in the year, we'll talk about accomplishments in that realm, but because it's all online based, let's get a little bit into it. By the way, this is a direct reference to that podcast I made about not deferring things till a later time. Not if you're looking to do something in your life, you have to just do it. You can't just put it off and continue to just defer things because time flies. And as you get older, as everybody tells you, but I will confirm it, as you get older and you get busier, that's also a key piece. Once you get busier in life, time flies so much faster. Sometimes it feels like a week passes in a day. So, back to topic. Started school in the beginning of the year, in addition to all my extracurriculars. Been a fun year. We'll talk about this year later on in another podcast. But because of the nature of school, it's all online based. So it's basically tests and education and posts and stuff like that. It's all done online, which is quite honestly pretty efficient. And knowing what I know now and knowing what I know about the specific school, I would likely have done it way, 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 way in the past, right? If this was available to me 3-4 years ago, I would have done it then, easily. With that being said, as mentioned in a previous podcast, in addition to not deferring things, getting things done now, you can't regret the past, and you have to kind of move forward with what you're presented with at the moment. Back to topic. So I started a class, and the benefit of this class is that there are some courses that, depending on my past and history and other classes I've taken, I can test out of classes. Meaning, I can take the test, and if I do well enough, I can essentially go and pass the class, get the credits, not really have to pay for the credits, not have to go through the weeks of school, because this is an accelerating learning path. So every 5 weeks, I'm in a new course. Boom, 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 right? So because of that, it saves me a lot of time and energy and stress and money in not having to pay for these courses. So every opportunity that I get to do a fast track, I do. And it's funny because, like, I had to take a class the other day about basically like product development and some like shipping and receiving, supply chain, and a couple of other little things, right? It's all kind of looped into one. And it was quite funny because the way the fast tracks work is essentially you go in, and it's an online, once again. So you go in and you set up a fast track and you take a test where it assesses like different levels of competency on the whole course of schoolwork. And depending on where that test lands, you either pass, fail. You could do a couple little things to tweak it, but you can pass or fail. And it's kind of funny because a lot of times I default to logic. And so while initially I want to say that I'm doing decent on these fast tracks because my ability to just logically think through things, that's probably not giving myself enough credit. And the reason why I say that is because some of the things that I'm drawing upon are things of my past. So what I mean by that, in order to kind of explain to you what I'm drawing on, we're going to have to go further back. So I've always done a lot of things. If it isn't fitness stuff, it was woodworking, which is now the thing. If it isn't that, it's learning about different things. I'm always trying to learn about something. And at some point, I was doing the YouTube thing where I was doing fitness and I was doing kind of YouTube vlogs, stuff like that. And with that, at some point, I decided to create a few products. And I created the Motivated Results line, which the name was the name of my YouTube channel at the time. I decided to make a few kind of clothing items, and that'll eventually, I think I'll come back around to that when I have more time, which I'm unfortunately not lucky enough to have at the moment. But I digress. I created a few clothing lines. Not clothing lines. I created a clothing line with a few products. And in doing so, it was a hard knocks learning experience, trial by fire, if you will, of learning how to put together a clothing brand, a website, a shop. What is it called? A merchant style site. There's a word for it. It's not coming to me at the moment. And in addition to that, creating ads and optimizing SEO search engines and trying to get the name out there. And not just that, it's also like creating the product, finding an artist, a designer, getting together with them, getting the vision correct, getting the design correct for screen printing, finding out the differences between screen printing and just like vinyl heat transfer. I mean, all these little things. And then when you start getting into like the little details that I used to have like special made tags, and I had to speak to seamstress to be able to get those on in the right place, location. I mean, there's just a lot of things in the air that have to be situated in order to have a streamlined process, a process that's also profitable, a process that's also very ready for an off-hands kind of scenario where you can just kind of move into production. So why did I get into all that? Well, that's essentially what this class was. This class was talking about a lot of those topics. And in talking about a lot of those topics, it refreshed my mind of some of the experiences I had back then trying to figure it out. It seems like a lot of the things I've kind of learned have always been trial by fire because I haven't had a traditional education in a lot of these things that I've kind of have interest in, right? Fitness being one of those, or the woodworking being another one. And so a lot of it is trial by fire. But in taking these fast tracks, that's been incredibly useful for me because I'm able to reference back to those ideas. I'm able to put the questions in a way where I can think through and apply them to my experiences at that time, and maybe in turn give me a little bit more understanding of what the question is really asking, and also helping me find the answer. And for those that are curious, I did pass that fast track. So I saved myself another few weeks of classes and such. But my point to this, my point that I'm hoping you're getting to with me along this journey, is the idea that if I would have chosen to maybe look back at my experiences and poo-pooed the lack of success, if you will, because I'm competitive and I'm a person that does enjoy being successful. And when I look back at some of my, potential endeavors, whether it's anything that I've done that has had a financial bias but has not been financially successful, if I look at those things and I poo-poo them and I say, oh man, the failure, and I just continue to be negative Nancy about my experiences, it's such a negative outlook to do such things. You have to look at them almost like as an education. And in this situation, it was a clear look that although that endeavor, if you will, didn't turn into a gigantic profitable situation, it was definitely an education that is now paying off for me in this realm, in the realm I find myself in now, where I'm taking classes, and I don't necessarily have to kill myself for another 5 weeks and spend X amount of money on an extra class. I literally just saved money, time, energy, stress in taking this course. And all of that is due to some of my experiences in the past. And if we go back to the previous podcast, when we talk about removing those things, that's probably one of the things I would have liked to have removed, some of my failures. But once again, it isn't without the failures that you develop the person who you are. It's not you are a combination of everything of your past, the good and the bad. And so if you remove the bad from your past, you might still not like the person that you would be, and in fact it might be a better or worse version of you and not a better version of you. I always like this saying, and we'll talk about this in a future podcast, but I always like the saying, and I'll present it to you now because maybe it'll give you a little bit of things to think about before we get into that podcast topic. But I've always liked the saying that goes something along the lines of this, because I can't for the life of me quote it, or at least feel like I'm doing it justice. But the quote goes along the lines of, the same water that softens a potato hardens an egg. And so if you take that and you dissect it a little bit, and you assume that the boiling water is stress, right, or hardship, that hardship is sometimes what makes people better. And in removing the hardship, you make people worse. I hope this podcast was interesting enough for you folks who have spent the time on it. I hope you enjoyed it. Like always, I tell people, if you enjoy these type of things, reach out, let me know, and or mostly share with someone. Say, hey, here's a couple minutes, listen to this. That's all I have for you folks this week. If you have questions, comments, reach out to me on Instagram, LifeGeneralist. And that's it. And I guess signing off for this week. I am LifeGeneralist, and this is Curious John.